On today's podcast, the student minister Michael Pearson joins us on Upon Further Review to discuss what is the role of student ministry in the life of the church, but specifically here at Field Street Baptist Church. So we are excited to have Michael Pearson as our guest.
Welcome to the Upon Further Review podcast, the podcast that takes a deeper look into topics seen throughout Scripture. As your host, Cody Kitchen, sits down with Dr. John Hall and a special guest to discuss what Scripture says and how we are to apply it to our lives.
Well, Michael, we are thankful and glad to have you on our podcast this afternoon, so welcome.
Thank you for having me. Excited to be here.
And we are excited to talk about the role of student ministry of the local church, but specifically the role of student ministry here at Field Street. So, Michael, what is the role of student ministry?
Yes, I think the role of student ministry covers a lot of things, but if I had to break it down to one kind of answer, I think that the role of student ministry is to work in a unified partnership with the church, specifically to disciple students to make Christ known. That's
good. It's a really good answer. And what is y'all's kind of main verse over the student ministry that y'all focus on?
So for us here at Field Street, our student ministry group is called Amplify. And so the verse to go along with that is Matthew 10:27, which says, "What I tell you in the darkness, speak in the light. And what you hear whispered in your ear, proclaim upon the housetops."
There you go. That's good. So with that kind of verse in mind, as well as talking about the answer that you just gave us of what the role of student ministry is, can you break that down of what does it mean to be in a unified partnership with the church? What does that mean?
I think working with the church as a whole to work towards discipling the students, but specifically the parents. I think it is so important for the student ministry as a whole to partner with the parents to raise these kids up.
And how do you do that, and what does that look like? And specifically too of like unified partnership, what does it mean? Like why did you specifically say unified partnership with the church? Like what has to be unified?
I think the vision and goals of the student ministry needs to be clearly communicated to the parents, and the parents have to be willing and able to align their values and sights with the ministry so that both are working in a partnership towards the growth of this student. Because often what you see happen 30, 40 years ago is this kind of silo approach to ministry, in which the student ministry was its own thing, the children's ministry was its own thing, the young adult ministry was its own thing, and it was all under one building called the church, but each one kind of did their own thing. And so for me, I think biblically speaking, we see in Proverbs and Ephesians of the entire church coming together to train up your children, to train them in the Lord. And so really aligning goals and the vision with the parents and the church as a whole to give these students what they need to be able to grow in the Lord is really what the role of the student ministry should be.
Yeah, that's good. And I'm sure John could speak to this a lot more, but yeah, I mean, the role of the church as a whole, not just talking specifically of one ministry, but as we say on this podcast, to make Christ known by what we say and how we live, or the proclamation of our faith. And that vision is not one separate vision, and then every ministry has its own separate vision, but it should be that every ministry here at Field Street comes off of that vision and continuing to do the work of God within each specific ministry by discipling students or children or whatever ministry that we specifically talk about.
So absolutely.
Yeah, the student ministry is not an entity unto itself. It fits under the umbrella of everything we're trying to do as a church, only you're doing that through the student ministry. Mm-hmm. And the student ministry isn't a babysitting service. The church provides for parents to escape from their children for a few hours. There is that component, but we are thoughtfully, carefully, and intentionally wanting to move students in the direction of knowing Christ and serving Him. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's really, piggybacking on what you've already said, and I appreciate what you said, and it's accurate. The student ministry shares the overall vision and mission of the church, only you're carrying it out in relationship with students.
Yep. And you kind of already hit at this a little bit, but one of the things that you have talked about is that not only unifying partnership with the church is important, but one of the key aspects to a youth ministry, as you have put it, is to partner with parents. So what does that mean?
To get the parents involved in the student's life with the foundation of Christ as the head of that relationship and what drives where the student is going and kind of how their upbringing takes place. And so the student ministry and the parents should, again, like the church, have a unified goal and vision for the upbringing of the children. And so for the student ministry to partner with the parents is to be communicative to the parents of what is going on, what's taking place, what the student ministry is doing, but also encourage the parents to be involved in the student's life in such a way that they are training them up in the Lord. So kind of bouncing off what John said, of it's not just a babysitting service where you drop your kid off and then we teach them about Jesus and you get to do everything else. But you should be coming alongside with the student ministry as a parent, and we should be together, unified, working towards teaching the student about who Christ is and to make him known.
Yeah.
Along those lines, I think it's important to establish that really the mentality and philosophy I think we have here at Field Street Baptist Church, and I would hope at any church that is a New Testament church, is the understanding that really the primary disciple makers of students are mom and dad. And what we provide at Field Street is truly supplemental. It shouldn't be the singular influence that's discipling students. I have a tremendous obligation, responsibility to my children, as do you and you, when they are students and even prior to their arriving in the student ministry. So I think what we're offering here at Field Street is a solid supplemental partnership with parents to help be useful in God's hands to form Christ in kids. But I think it's important to denote that the church doesn't have the single responsibility of discipling.
Absolutely.
What we do have the responsibility to equip parents to further disciple their kids. I personally think this is the most difficult aspect of student ministry, the ministry with the parents.
Yeah.
It's hit and miss.
Absolutely.
And I think I completely value it and applaud you for your efforts in establishing that and encourage you to continue to do that. But you have to have the cooperation of parents, and that can be hit and miss. Plus, it takes time on your end to get to know parents.
Yeah.
At the same time, knowing the kids.
Well, and the reality is, too, on average, you have 4 hours a week with the students as far as student ministry. At best, you have 2 hours with most students because a lot of students don't come to both of those, whether it be Wednesday night and Sunday night. And the reality is the parents have more time than you do, or the ministry does, but even more than that, the school, if they go to a school, has more time. The teachers have more time. And so whom they're in, and I know that we can talk about this in really any of these topics, but whom the students are being influenced by a majority of time is more than the church in some aspects of it. And so having that partnership with parents and knowing what's going on outside of these four walls is absolutely important, and it matters how you react with that. So as John said, absolutely applaud you in making that for sure. And in the answer, you talked about how to disciple students to make Christ known. And obviously that means that we are to disciple the students to know Christ and to make him known. But what does that mean? Can you kind of expound on what does discipling mean, and specifically what does that look like with students?
Yeah, so with the student ministry and students, essentially what the student ministry does is every aspect of the ministry, every different event, every different Bible study or small group or worship time is all set for the purpose of making Christ known to the students, in which we teach the students who Christ is. We engage the Word of God to make him known both in mind and heart, and every subsequential thing that we do as a student ministry is to just train them in who Christ is, to act like him, to learn about him, to engage with him in our worship and our prayer and our spiritual disciplines. And so to disciple a student is to take a student and teach them all the ways in which we engage with Christ.
That's good.
Yeah. Real good.
And it's so important discipleship nowadays is so many people separate discipleship, and I know we're going to talk about this, separate evangelism, and they really go hand in hand in training and teaching, not just students, but church members in general, people whom love Christ, training and teaching them to continue in the Great Commission to go and make disciples. So that's great, and that's great. That's an emphasis of your ministry for sure. And then you also talk about how they are to, and we as Christians are to engage in worship. So what does that look like in the context of student ministry?
So for student ministry, it's we have our own separate time on Wednesday nights, which I truly do value, because for students, they are so busy with everything else going on in life. They go to school, they have all the extracurricular stuff, and especially nowadays, it all just seems to pile up more and more. And so when we take a special time out of the week on a Wednesday night, and we get to come together, and it's just students fellowshipping with other students, and we get to focus and engage in a night of worship in which we are mirroring what the church does as a whole, and to sing songs of praise. We open up His Word. I preach a sermon to the students. The students take notes, and then from there we break off into our small groups, and we have a time of discussion in which we break down the lesson or the sermon, and then there's also a specific time of prayer. And so for our Wednesdays, they're so special to me, and I love them so much because it gives the students a time in which they're separated from everything else that is going on in life. They're separated from their school, they're separated from their parents, they're just surrounded by other students, and it's this moment of independency where they get to dive into the faith themselves. And so to engage in a night of worship with a student ministry in which it is truly something that they want to do, and they're not being forced into doing it, to me, I treasure those times. So to engage in worship for the student is to mirror what the church is already doing on a Sunday morning, but in a student-specific setting.
That's good. And as John says, he says it often. We talked about this in the last week's podcast, and you said that, I think in the first sermon, that the worship hour that we have on a Sunday morning really is the crown jewel of our faith. And so that's so important. And I think it's so important, and you do this really well, so that's why I'm bringing it to light. But it's so important that we don't separate those times of worship, that there's the student ministry, and then we have Sunday morning church, because once the students graduate, because they will grow and they get older, it's almost as if, well, my time at student ministry, that was my church. I no longer have a church, but nowhere do we see that biblically. That's supposed to happen. And so I'm saying that, applauding you of making that such an emphasis, that they are part of the church now, and they are the church. And so way to go on that. And I think that's so important for sure.
Yeah, I concur. I appreciate the effort you put in on Wednesday nights. I think it has a nice draw, not only for Field Street students, but for students in the student culture of our community. And I have argued, and I will continue to do so, that the grand engagement of the church is worship. I think everything about the Christian life flows out of our understanding of who God is and how we are to respond to Him. So I appreciate I think the kids that come on Wednesday night, and even Sunday as well, but we're talking about Wednesday night, are getting meat and potatoes in our student ministry. I think there's time for fun and fellowship, and those things are happening. But I think if we're going to err, we should err on the side of providing substance. I think you have to have both, which the old argument, which wing of the aircraft is most important, the right or the left?
Yeah.
Both. So
what I really find interesting about student ministry, and specifically ministries that focus on really making engagement with worship the top priority, is exactly what Cody was talking about, what students do after they graduate. And that when you look over the last 20, 30 years, and you look at the demographic of students who were engaged in worship on a Wednesday night, where the focus was praise and worship of God, engagement with His holy word, and focus on spiritual disciplines, those students, more often than not, will end up attending a Sunday service as they continue to grow. But the student ministries that are just fun and that's all you get, those students tend to fall off because they're no longer getting that on Sunday mornings. They're no longer getting the blow-up houses and the nothing but games. And Yeah, I think there's a balance to it for sure within the student ministry, because you want to be appealing to students, and sometimes students do just need a break and need to blow off some steam and have some fun. But really, the point of the ministry is to worship the Lord.
That's good. That's good. And another aspect in which you talk about in the answering of that is the practicing of spiritual disciplines. So again, in the student ministry, what does that look like, and how does that coincide and unify within the church?
Yeah, so the practice of spiritual disciplines for students shouldn't look any different than anybody else in the church, in which their time that they spend reading the Word, spend in prayer, spend meditating, spend in worship, all of that should look the same as any other member of the church, in which there's that unified partnership where the entire church is engaged in being disciplined with the Lord. And for students, I think it's so much more important that they really begin to learn the foundation of what it means to have spiritual disciplines now. That the younger that you are able to recognize the importance of it, because you are going out every day into a world that is, one, lacking discipline, but two, is almost completely against everything that you are learning within Scripture. That you need to be disciplined, you need to be prepared, you need to put on the full armor of God. And for students to go to school every day, they are in that type of environment and setting that they can't just leave and walk away from. They are engaged in battle every single day. So I think it's really important for students to be able to practice spiritual disciplines, and it's the role of the student ministry within that to teach them how to do it.
That's good.
Yeah, it's great. I don't think real progress is made in any of our lives in any area without discipline and rigor.
Absolutely.
The Bible speaks to this. We're in Proverbs, and Proverbs says the same thing in every chapter. It feels like that. And I was working in chapter 9 today, and it talks about the value of discipline. And I mean, look at all the great athletes or academicians, whatever field of life you want to look at. And those who are the GOATs, there's no doubt they had to discipline themselves in some way, to master yourself in some way. I read Tom Brady's book, TB12. That's not an endorsement, by the way. But I read it because say what you want about him, and people do, but he understood the value of discipline, and disciplining, like, his diet is weird and legendary, but no one would argue against the results of it.
Yeah.
So the same is applicable in the life we live with Christ. You have to have the disciplines, and it's the disciplines that I think over a period of time God uses to produce fruit.
Yeah, and I'm going to be saying the same thing, just in a different way. But it's so important. In Colossians chapter 3, verse 1, it talks about that we're to keep setting and keep putting our mind on Christ. And that is, we do that with our spiritual disciplines. And, we can have a whole podcast on spiritual disciplines, of what each spiritual discipline is and what that means. And the Bible's chock full of spiritual disciplines that we all should follow and continue to grow in, whether that be reading the Word, praying, tithing, you name it, fasting, all of these spiritual disciplines that we know of. It's so important that as students, especially, because I even think of my own when I was in high school, of how influential your peers are, not only to you, but you are to them. And I think when you're strong, as you said, in those spiritual disciplines and putting the full armor of God, not only are you not going to be swayed, but the example that you are to your students, it matters so much, and way more than I think we actually realize.
Absolutely.
In that. It's really good. Another one, and I love this one, is community outreach and service. And so what does that look like for the student ministry?
I think one thing that everyone can come to agreement with is that students have a ton of energy. They are at the point in their lives where they are so young and full of energy. To just let that go to waste and not do anything with it, to me, is just a shame. Yeah. And the student ministry is a ministry full of kids who are on fire and love Jesus, and the Scriptures, especially in 1 Peter 4 tells us to love our community and our neighbors and to serve them. And so why not take that youthfulness and that young energy and go out and outreach to the community? Go and do service projects that they won't be able to do in 30, 40, 50 years because our bodies just can't handle it. And so to take that energy, to take the students, and to truly do outreach and service projects as a student ministry, one, it's teaching the kids what Christ has done in service to us, but two, it's also teaching everyone that we engage with that those who follow Christ truly are doing it in an outward way to try to tell others about him.
That's good. One of the things I can't stand is when people say, I wish we were out in the community a lot more. And I think I know what they mean and the sentiment that they are saying, but in reality,
that's stupid.
That is stupid. I agree.
There it is.
But the student ministry, the children's ministry, the church as a whole, there's so many things that we do on a daily basis that is outreaching. And I know for a fact, because I've gotten to participate in some of those outreaches that the student ministry does, that you do plan those, and it's such a great job. But also, too, it's a lot of people don't think the outreach that's most important is the outreach that each individual does individually. And so I know that John's made it an emphasis for the church as a whole, but I know you have too as student ministry, is what does that look like in sharing Christ and being the outreach by helping your friend, by helping your neighbor, by doing something that you don't have to do, but you're doing it because you love Jesus. So that's one of the greatest outreaches, and I know that's something you emphasize really well.
I will say that it was the mission trips that I took as a student in junior high and high school that had such a formative impact in my life. I'll go to my grave arguing that. First Dumas was so careful and thoughtful about our mission trips and everything it incorporated. I'm so thankful I had the opportunity to go and participate because it really shaped my young life in a meaningful way. So I'm glad for all the outreach efforts that our student ministry makes in whatever form that looks like.
Absolutely. Another one kind of going hand in hand with discipleship, but evangelism. And what does that look like in the context of student ministry?
Students are really interesting when it comes to evangelism because it is the scariest thing to them until they do it.
Yeah.
And as soon as they do it once, they can't get enough. We practice it over and over. We talk about it. We proclaim the gospel every Wednesday, every Sunday. They get the gospel presentation. And even in our small groups, the very first question every week is, what is the gospel? And it's preparing them and training them so they can be more comfortable. So when it comes time for them to share the gospel, they have the opportunity to do so, and they know it in their hearts, so they don't have to sit there and think and fumble over the words that they might be fearful of. But it's always interesting to me that especially in mission trips, where we've done door-to-door evangelism or some type of outreach in which we just evangelize to people. So in New Orleans, we did evangelism in the park, and the students are petrified the very first time they go out. And then as soon as they share the gospel once, that's all they want to do for the rest of the trip. Everything else just goes to the wayside, and they just want to evangelize. So it's always really interesting to me to see the passion and drive that the students really have once they do it. And so getting them to that point of doing it can be the tricky part. But for students, again, it just goes back to that high energy life that they have where when they get hooked on something, man, that's all they want to do. And so one thing that I really love about our students is they love to evangelize when they do it.
It's great. Yeah. We've talked about this often on the podcast as well. I know John has preached about it a lot too, is oftentimes, and I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but oftentimes we think evangelism is the go door knocking, the one and done evangelism, which there's time and place for it. And I think mission trip is a time and place for it for sure. But we also are called to go in Matthew 28 to go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. And so even as the what does that look like to do that? And I know for a fact as you are doing those questions of the gospel, but even in every aspect, whether it be young adults, children, senior adults, the church as a whole, it should always be our obligation that we continue to share the love of Christ with our barber, with the person in the line at the grocery store. And that it's, John has talked about that it's like a plant that we are gardening. We're toiling the soil, and it's something that we live life doing. It's not just. I think when people think of evangelism, they instantly have that fear because it's that one, knock the door, share Christ, and then it's done with. But it's that emphasis of it's more than just that. I think there's times for that, and God uses that just as much as He uses the other two.
Yeah, a lot of times, I think individual believers get hung up on the pragmatic component. I got to know all the diagnostic questions, and really, it would just be a victory when and if our church comes to the realization, every believer that's a part of Field Street comes to the realization that really evangelism is a lifestyle. It's as you are going, you make Christ known, and you don't have to. You don't have to have. That can be a helpful tool, but you don't have to have some memorized framework. I really think maybe we've done ourselves a disservice. Although I think evangelism in Southern Baptist life decades ago was very effective with kind of the more pragmatic approaches. But man, the times have changed, and so really having building relationships seems to be the key, especially if you're going to be somewhere a while. Getting to know people's names, like what you're talking about at the restaurant. We go get a burrito a couple of times a week, knowing the names of the people behind the counter. Anyway, I think there's real value in what you're doing with our students, and I'm grateful you're doing it, teaching them, giving them tools. And then that gets coupled with the light's going to come on at some point by God's grace where they go, you know what? I really need to start in my own home and my neighborhood, my school campus, my basketball team, wherever, the band.
And one of the great things about our students is there's a group of them that have begun to do that. There's a group of older girls, upperclassmen, that they've just started Bible studies, and they started inviting all their friends. They're like, we're going to do this anyways, so just come join us. Come learn about the Bible. If you have questions, you can ask us. We'll try to answer. If not, we'll go ask Michael. And so just kind of seeing them take that aspect of truly applying it to their entire life, as you said.
And that really is the organic component of it. That's hard to beat.
It is.
Yep, absolutely. And that's a perfect segue into number 7, where we look at fellowship with other students. And so what does that look like? I think it's a perfect segue into that, of that concept.
I think often the term fellowship isn't fully understood by most people, and that truly fellowship in biblical terms is the sharing of one another's lives. If you're having fellowship with someone, you are sharing your life with them. And I try to emphasize that to the students that, when we gather on Wednesdays and we have these time of fellowship, or even when you're out at school and you're talking to your friends, or you're hanging out at your house, or doing whatever you do, that you're sharing life with one another. And so if your life is centered and focused upon Christ, that fellowship that you'll be sharing is Him. That everything you say and do will be centered around Him. And so to take that time of fellowship that we have and for students to fellowship with one another is just that organic component of evangelism, in which students are sharing Christ through the way they live.
That's good. And I think it's so important. It brings up Hebrews chapter 10, verse 24 and 25, that not forsaking our own assembling together. And I think that's so important in life, any of our lives, in the believers' lives, that we don't forsake what the fellowship in which we have, and especially the students. And as we've already talked about in the principles before, is it's so important that all of these aspects are a part of the fellowship as they unite together. So it's good. Continuing on, you talk about ministering to student-specific needs. There's no way students have specific needs, right? They're all the same, right?
No. Each student is so wildly different. And so within the role of student ministry is to take each one of these students and the backgrounds that they come from, and you really have to approach each one differently. That for one student who comes from a 2-parent household is not going to be able to sit down and learn and focus the exact same way as someone who comes from a broken home. and that you really have to minister to their needs, because one student might learn a specific way and be engaged a specific way, and the other student won't. And so to be able to take moments like that of discipling these students, sitting down, having conversations, fostering relationships, engaging them in all of the activities that we do, it just looks a little different for these students. And sometimes students need to be ministered to. And that's why I love our leadership up in the student ministry here at Field Street, is they are absolutely fantastic at recognizing the needs of each individual student on a Sunday morning, on a Wednesday night, and they will minister to them. Just last night, we had one of our leaders praying with a young man who just needed someone to talk to. And so he sat down and talked, and he took time and stayed after, and he prayed with him. And to be able to recognize what students are going through, that they are at such a different point in life than everyone else, where there's so much going on nowadays. We're post-COVID, everyone's kind of back into the swing of things, and everything was just thrown to these students at once. They just need a little extra help. And so one of the things that we have up in the student room, up in the youth room, is a prayer board. And more often than not, those prayers include some type of dealing with anxiety, dealing with stress, trying to deal with all of the other things that life is throwing at them. And so to be able to minister to those students, discuss what they need, talk to them in a specific way to point out that Christ really is there to meet them where they need him. And that Christ, in having faith in him, he provides the healing necessary for you to continue on past these needs and your suffering and whatever you may be going through.
Yeah, that's good. And I think we all can speak at this, because I know at some point in our ministries, you currently have led in student ministry. And for me, when I was in student ministry, it's so important to being a part of the student lives and being present outside of the four walls. And I saw more growth in the students' lives outside of the quote-unquote church walls, meeting with them, going to their sports games, going to their parents' things that the parents get to know you. There's something about it, and I think even when I was a youth, when someone whom you look up to cares about you and recognizes that you are important to me. And I remember when I was in swimming, having one of the leaders from the youth group I was in coming to those events, and I was more excited for him to be there than my own father. Not in anything. It was just, man, it's someone new. My dad was always there, and I appreciated that about my dad. But having someone who didn't have to be there, quote unquote, but wanted to be there, wanted to get to know me. And so I think there's so much more of meeting to those specific needs, that it's so much more than just inside the walls, even though that's so important. Yeah. But really, there's so much that happens. There's so much that takes the distractions away from the students, especially nowadays. They're with TV, with movies, with social media, and it's so much harder even as the minister to try to get in, or in leader to just try to get in, and how can you minister to that specific need and role?
That's good.
Going quickly on these next two, but you talk about encouraging leadership. What is that? What does that mean?
Yeah, so one of the things that we do for the student ministry at Field Street is really encourage the kids to lead out in the way that they're living their lives, to take the fellowship that they have, to take everything that they learn within the student ministry, and then to go forth and apply it to their lives in such a way where they are teaching and showing and leading others how to do the same. And so encouraging the students that you don't have to be a hidden Christian, that those spiritual disciplines that you do where you read your Bible, you pray, you can do that out in public. You can go forth and you can lead others, or the relationships that you make with your friends, you can talk to them and have discussions and lead them to continue to make Christ known. And so just encouraging the students to be leaders within their community, within their school, to effectively make Christ known.
That's good. That's good. And number 10, you talk about prepare the future.
Yeah, preparing the future of students, in that students are the future generation. They're the future of the church. They're the future of our communities. They're the future of our nation and our world. And so the role of the student ministry is to prepare the future. You are preparing what is to come. You're preparing the church. You're preparing your communities, the globe, essentially, and that going through all these things to disciple students, to make to know Christ and to make him known by engaging in worship, by practicing spiritual disciplines, through community outreach and service, evangelism, fellowship, ministering to their specific needs, and encouraging leadership is all to prepare the future of the church.
Yeah, that's good. And I know what is said by that for sure and what is meant by saying prepare the future. But another thing that I think gets lost in that too is we have to understand that the student ministry, the children, specifically the student ministry, when those that come to know Christ, they're the church now. And learning that those things now does prepare them for the future. Absolutely. Because when they go to college and they don't have mommy and daddy holding their hand, but they have a professor who's teaching them something completely different than you taught them, that's important. And it's so important that I think sometimes churches as a whole have really forgotten that, yeah, they are the future. You need to prepare them, but you also need to prepare them now because there's something that's going to happen that's going to hit them once they go into the real world. So that's good, and so good that that's an emphasis for sure.
It's good. If I may, I'd just like to affirm you, Michael, for the great work you're doing with our students. We appreciate all your efforts and labors and your obvious and genuine love for our kids. Thank you for being a team player on our staff, and may God bless and make fruitful all your efforts with our students. And then I'd also like to affirm our church. I don't know of a church that is more generous and more willing to do what is necessary to create an environment where we continue the enormous lift of reaching students.
Absolutely.
I'm so grateful to be a part of Field Street. And through the years, I've observed our church's generosity. It's a rare dynamic in a church that Field Street is so selfless when it comes to making sure our students have every opportunity that we can provide them to have Christ formed in their lives. I'm very appreciative to be a part of our church.
Absolutely.
For many reasons, one of which is that.
Yeah, thank you for the encouraging words, but absolutely, our church is so loving, and to see the members of the church when they engage with the students through either giving or just the time in which they have conversations, you can tell there's a genuine love there, and that's something that I haven't seen between a church and their common member and a student ministry anywhere else.
Yeah. Well, case in point will be February 9th with our annual student dessert auction. I mean, it's ridiculous what the people give for brownies.
It's all for the brownies.
Yeah. Not some of them.
It's true. I mean,
and you know who you are out there, you people.
Yeah, you know. But I mean, I could say the same. We are thankful that you came on the podcast, especially, and sharing with what the student ministry is doing. It's great, and it's great to get to know you, and great to see also the growth that's happening as well. So we're excited for the future.
Absolutely.
For sure.
Absolutely.
Now, the most favorite part, or that stupid segment. So, John, what is stupid today?
Everything.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm fed up today. I'm ready for president to get inaugurated and kind of get on with it.
Yeah,
I'm ready. Nice. I'm ready for the playoffs. I love the playoff football, but it's stupid.
The best football.
That's playoff football, man. Yeah. Go Texans.
Go Texans is right.
And don't bet, people. That is stupid. Betting on any aspect of a football game.
Well, according to the NFL, if you bet responsibly.
Yeah. Man, what a genius marketing tool that was.
And drink responsibly.
And drink responsibly and bet responsibly, but don't do them at the same time. Yeah. Yes. Oh, man, I'm telling you what. I work way too hard to just blow money on betting.
Yeah, that's for sure. And especially in playoffs, anything can happen.
And does.
Exactly.
It does. I mean, who would have thought the 14-2, or was it 15-2, 14-3 Minnesota Vikings got ran out of town? I mean, they got crushed.
Well, as a Texans fan, I honestly didn't think we were going to be here. And look what happened.
I know. I don't know. The Texans are so streaky.
They are streaky.
Well, their defense is good. I hope they give what's that guy? Who's the quarterback at Kansas City?
Oh, yeah, I don't know.
What's his name? He names his kids after metal alloys. What?
Mahomes. Oh, Patrick Mahomes.
Yeah, him.
Mahomes.
Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah, he's a freak of nature. I wouldn't want to play him. I wouldn't want to. I don't want my team. which they already did last year, to face him in the last few minutes of a game, and he has the ball. He always gets them in the win column.
We'll see how that turns out.
Exactly.
So,
well,
but I am proud to say I did not bet on that game.
and we're thankful for that.
I don't.
Yeah.
By the way, I don't bet on any game, but I sure didn't bet on that game.
Well, before this gets out of hand,
Yeah,
no,
it's
it's been
already out of hand.
it's been a great discussion. Thank you again, Michael,
Yes.
for joining us. And remember, as always, make Christ known by what you say and how you live.